A fan of South Plains politics? Well, here's your talking points this week. Governor Greg Abbott is calling for changes to the state's bail system after a state trooper is killed in the line of duty. And controversy as hundreds of migrant children remain in U.S. custody after their parents were deported without them.
From the studios of KMAC Television in Lubbock, your local election headquarters. This is Talking Points with Bryan Mudd, brought to you by Capital Mortgage Services.
Thanks for joining us this week, everybody. Also going on this week, the summer days are dwindling away, and for most kids in our area, it's out of the pool and into the classroom. Now, you may have spent your weekend taking advantage of those tax-free binders, backpacks, and supplies, but the Select Committee on Violence in Schools and School Security was busy releasing their final report of their policy recommendations for how to keep your kids safe. The committee was appointed by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick in the wake of the May 18th shooting at a Santa Fe high school, where 8 students and 2 teachers were killed. Senator Larry Taylor represents the Santa Fe area and now heads that committee. He says this report details the summaries of the 4 public hearings that were held covering school infrastructure, resource officers, mental health, and red flag proposals. Taylor says protecting Texas kids will take complete cooperation from and the commitment of the state, local districts, parents, teachers, and the community. The truth is that we're living in a new era, and what we've done in the past is no longer enough. They say now it's up to the 86th legislature to take action. You can read that full final report online at senate.texas.gov under the committees section. And although the kids had a nice long break, the staff at our local school districts were busy. Over at LISD, they say they've been working on ways to make school as safe as possible before that first day of class. KMAC's Tori Larned checked in to see how they've amped up their security measures.
We are training for the day that we hope never comes, but we will be prepared if it should.
A constant concern for parents. Will my kids be safe at school this year? Lubbock ISD says yes. And it starts with making sure everyone is on the same page.
So when we use the word lockout, that means that things are continuing normally inside, that the threat is away from the school, but we're acting in a proactive way. When we say lockdown moving forward, that means there's an active threat inside the school. The doors are closed, the lights are out, and students are out of sight.
Nancy Sharp from Lubbock ISD says to keep the school safe, parents and visitors have to stop holding the door open for others.
Our process is for that door to lock, and then someone who's in the office looking out on the video camera to assess that person and decide whether or not to allow them in the building.
They're also making sure the hallways are a safe place for any student who needs someone to lend an ear.
Helping identify students who might be in crisis and need extra support.
We want to make sure that you build a rapport with the students so that they trust you and know that they can come and that you're going to do the right thing and take care of their issue, whatever it might be.
LISD Chief of Police Jody Cyphers says during the first week of school, teachers will show kids what to do in an emergency.
We've implemented the training throughout the district. The teachers, as they come in, will get the training that'll be passed on to students and, of course, parents.
As a dad and an officer, Cyphers wants parents to know his officers will be there, making sure school is a safe place for kids to learn and grow.
Their staff are very caring, they're very competent, and they're going to make sure that our kids are safe.
Tori Larned, KMAC News.
And our Texas Capitol correspondent Wes Rappaport has been following the statewide efforts to ramp up school security and make changes. Wes is joining us now from Austin, and it's always good to see you.
Good to be with you, Avery.
Now, I know you've talked to everybody really from the top down. That's legislators, superintendents, even those school resource officers themselves. What do you think is really the main changes or initiatives, main big pushes that you've heard from all of these levels?
Well, what we are seeing coming out of these meetings is a really strong emphasis on mental health. Hardening schools, something else that they talked about, and you know, these meetings also covered red flag laws, gun safety, but the outcomes of the report didn't really put as much of an emphasis on the weapons and that side of things. So there is much more of a focus on mental health training, but not just for students, but for faculty members on campuses across the state as well, Avery.
And you touched on that mental health aspect. I know that's something that you talked a lot about with Representative Price. I think we have a soundbite from him from your interview. Could we play that really fast and take a listen?
clearly, there are indicators, if you go back and look at all these instances of student violence, school shootings, there were symptoms of disorders, and there were problems that existed. And so the more that we can do on the front end, you know, to provide the resources to really stop, you know, maybe a problem from getting worse and from developing further, I think that's important.
And I know he sat in on some of the governor's roundtables on the topic of school safety, obviously touching on, you know, getting in on that mental health aspect on the front end. Anything else from that discussion and from those roundtables that came out that, you know, kids and parents may find interesting?
Well, it's clear that this conversation is far from over. Just because these meetings have happened here over the interim, of course, it's summer break for a lot of folks, right? So as we get into the session in January, that is really where you're going to see, at least from the state side, much of that work happening. Now, I talked to Price about the fact that there is a significant amount of time before the session starts, and, you know, kids going back to school this week and next week, right? So I said, you know, what are some of those concerns that parents are having, and how do you quell some of those fears of folks who are worried about sending their kids back into class? You know, he said it is perfectly okay for families to be worried, but the districts have been working on their own individual plans. They've been working on plans with state officials as well, law enforcement agencies across the board. Because it really does take a village to handle some of those tough situations, you know, and what it really boils down to is ultimately students, staff, parents, district officials, law enforcement administrators, and members of the community really are all going to have to come together to identify some of the challenges, identify what they can do to overcome those challenges, and speak up if they see suspicious behavior while legislators work on long-term solutions.
And you mentioned there that variance from district to district. I know here in the hub city, something that we've talked to LISD about was having a school officer at every high school campus. Also, ramping up those mental health resources for students. Are those things pretty common from what you've seen across Texas? And do you think, you know, that variance really just depends on the districts themselves?
Well, each district is going to have its own internal conversations, right? I mean, some of the school programs and the school districts on the South Plains look a lot different than a program like Dallas ISD, Houston ISD, much larger scale, Austin ISD here in the capital city. Those programs look a lot different. The security plans look a lot different. And so, you know, lawmakers wholeheartedly agree that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. I think school districts recognize that, and so with that comes difficulties in funding, you know, where to distribute some of this money, where are officials at the local and state levels going to decide which districts need more attention than others. And, you know, I recently attended a session with school resource officers hosted by sort of a regional conglomerate of federal, regional, and state officials. And one of the things that they were really talking about was all of the work being done at all those levels. You know, at the federal level, we heard from Congressman Michael McCall, who's working on the Securing Our Schools Act. That requires more federal involvement in school security and safety funding, and the Fix NICS Act, which we saw in the aftermath of the Sutherland Springs shooting, Avery, that was championed by Republican Senator John Cornyn, signed by the president in March, and that takes a much closer look at the government's background check systems, strengthening those systems. And so, you know, at these programs, and we have seen counselors, resource officers getting a chance to interact with each other so that the first time that they're having that interaction is not during a crisis. And they also can bounce ideas off each other. Here's what works in my district. You may try this in your district, Avery.
Very interesting. I know this is still in the early stages of this conversation on a national scale, a state scale, and then right here at home. So we appreciate you tracking it for us. I know this is not going to be the last time we're discussing it as our kids head back to school. But for now, Wes, we're going to let you go. Thanks so much for joining us from the Capitol.
Thanks, Avery.
Now that brings us straight to this week's poll question. Are you in favor of schools implementing a clear bag or backpack policy as a part of these safety reforms? Talk to us on our KMAC News Facebook page and on everythinglubbock.com. Click on Talking Points and give us your opinion. Well, still ahead, the nation's already looking ahead to those midterm elections and some special elections and primaries this past week proving to be big indicators. We're going to be spending 5 good minutes with ABC's Chief of Politics to break it all down.